The wind in this part of the country had a language all its own, and it never spoke of comfort. It was a dry, rasping tongue that scoured the land, carrying the grit of the plains in its breath and whispering tales of hardship through the skeletal branches of the mesquite trees. It had sculpted the very hills into weary, slumped shoulders and bleached the sky to a pale, unforgiving blue. This was the West of 1880, a place that demanded everything from a person and offered little in return but the vast, aching beauty of its own desolation. On the highest of these hills, overlooking the huddle of buildings that called itself the town of Harmony Creek, sat the cemetery. It wasn't a place of manicured lawns and marble angels. It was a raw patch of earth, consecrated only by the sorrow of those who had clawed graves from the rocky soil. The markers were mostly simple wooden crosses, tilted by the wind's constant assault, their inscriptions fading under the relentless sun. Here, the silence was broken only by that ceaseless wind and the jagged caw of the crows that wheeled in the sky above, black sentinels watching over the dead. Clara May Thompson moved through this landscape like a ghost sculpted from its own dust, young, though her eyes held a weariness that belied her 24 years. She was a widow, a title that, in Harmony Creek, was less a statement of loss and more a brand of judgment. She wore a simple, dark calico dress, practical and faded, the only concession to mourning being its somber hue. In her hands, she cupped a small, precious bundle of white roses, their petals startlingly pure against the muted browns and ochres of the world. She had traded 2 of her laying hens for them, a price that would mean leaner meals for a week. But it was a debt she felt compelled to pay. She stopped before a fresh mound of earth, marked by a cross of hewn pine. The name was carved deep and certain into the wood, Eli Stone. Beneath it, the simple epitaph, "A good man." Her fingers, calloused from farm work, trembled as she laid the roses gently on the dirt. The thorns pricked her skin, a small, sharp pain that was a welcome distraction from the vast, dull ache in her chest. A good man. It was the highest praise this land offered, and for Eli, it was the truest. He had died 2 weeks ago, not from sickness or a fool's accident, but in a hail of gunfire in the center of town. The Miller gang, drunk on whiskey and their own cruelty, had decided to shoot up the general store. While the sheriff and his deputy were pinned down, Eli had stepped out from the smithy, his Colt in his hand, his voice calm and steady, drawing their fire to give the townsfolk time to take cover. He'd taken down 2 of them before a bullet found its home in his chest. He had died to protect them, to protect her. The town hailed him as a hero, but for Clara, the loss was a silent, personal devastation that had hollowed her out from the inside. She stood there, letting the wind tug at the loose strands of honey-blonde hair that had escaped her bun, and she remembered. Memory was a treacherous thing out here. It could be a warm fire on a cold night, or a venomous snake striking from the shadows. With Eli, it was always the fire. She remembered his eyes. They were the color of a summer sky just before a storm, a deep and thoughtful gray. They were the only eyes in Harmony Creek that had ever looked at her without seeing the ghost of her dead husband. Jedediah Thompson. Jedediah, the schemer, the cheat, the man who had died of a fever in a federal prison, leaving her with his name, his debts, and the town's unshakable scorn. She was the trader's widow, an outcast who lived on the edge of town, working a small, unforgiving plot of land because it was all she had left. But Eli hadn't seen the trader's widow. He had seen Clara. He had seen the strain in her shoulders and the dirt under her fingernails. He'd started showing up at her small farmstead a year ago, without a word of explanation. He'd just appear at her fence line, leading his steady roan, and spend an afternoon mending a broken gate, or reinforcing a corral post, or helping her reshoe her stubborn old mule. He never asked for payment, and he rarely spoke unless spoken to. His presence was a quiet, sturdy thing, as reliable as the sunrise. She remembered his hands, broad, strong, mapped with the calluses of a man who knew hard work. She'd watched those hands gentle a spooked horse, split a cord of wood with powerful, economic swings, and, once, carefully extract a splinter from her own palm with a patience that made her breath catch in her throat. They were hands that could take and break, but with her, they had only ever offered to build and to mend. And she remembered the nights, the stolen moments that were theirs and theirs alone. After a long day's work, he would sometimes stay, and they would build a small fire outside her cabin, under a thick blanket of stars, with the coyotes singing their lonesome songs in the distance. The rigid lines of society would blur and fade away. The world would shrink to the two of them, bathed in the fire's flickering glow. They spoke of small things, the price of feed, the coming winter, a hawk he'd seen circling the canyon, but in the silences between the words, something deeper was communicated. It was in the way he'd pass her a tin cup of coffee, their fingers brushing for a moment too long. It was in the quiet understanding in his gaze, a look that said he knew her struggle and admired her for it. One night, a sudden, violent thunderstorm had rolled in, and he'd been caught at her farm. The rain came down in sheets, turning the world outside into a roaring chaos. Inside her small cabin, with a fire crackling in the hearth, the storm had created an intimacy that was both terrifying and undeniable. It was in that small, protected space that a boundary had been crossed. It hadn't been a wild, reckless passion. It had been something quieter, deeper, a slow, inevitable turning toward one another, a silent acknowledgement of the solitude that defined both their lives, a coming together that was as natural and as powerful as the storm raging outside. It was a comfort for the deep ache of loneliness, a moment of warmth in a cold, hard world. It felt like a confession, a secret shared without words, a promise whispered against the skin. The memory was so vivid, so warm, that for a moment she felt his presence beside her, the solid weight of him, the scent of leather and dust and clean sweat. A tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was this memory that made the finality of the grave so unbearable. He was gone, and their secret, the one beautiful, rebellious thing she had ever claimed for herself, was buried with him. A soft sound behind her broke the spell, the scrape of a boot on loose gravel. Clara stiffened. She was not accustomed to visitors, especially not here. This hill was her sanctuary, the one place she could grieve without the prying, judgmental eyes of the town. Annoyance flickered through her sorrow. She took a slow, deliberate breath, schooling her features into the stoic mask she wore for the world, and turned. The sight that met her eyes stole the air from her lungs. Standing not 10 feet away was a woman. She was tall and slender, and she was dressed in a way that was so utterly alien to this place that Clara's mind struggled to comprehend it. The woman was wearing a wedding dress. It was made of black silk, intricately detailed with jet beads and lace that shimmered like a spider's web in the harsh sunlight. A black veil was pinned to her elaborate, dark hair, obscuring the upper half of her face but doing nothing to hide the pallor of her skin or the perfect blood-red bow of her lips. She looked like a creature from a Gothic novel, a raven-winged angel of sorrow who had lost her way and ended up in this god-forsaken dust bowl. But it was the woman's eyes, visible through the fine mesh of the veil, that held Clara captive. They were wide with a state of shock so profound it mirrored Clara's own. They were fixed, not on Clara, but on the freshly turned earth of Eli's grave, and the stark white roses resting upon it. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind whipped the black veil around the stranger's face and tugged at Clara's simple dress, binding them together in its restless energy. The crows cawed overhead, their calls sounding like mocking laughter. Finally, the woman in black took a hesitant step forward, her hand rising to her throat. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the voice of this land. It was cultured, refined, with the soft edges of the East still clinging to it. It was a voice that was brittle, like thin ice, on the verge of shattering. Pardon me, she began, her gaze flicking from the grave to Clara, a storm of confusion in their depths. There must be some mistake. This is the grave of Eli Stone? Clara found her own voice and was surprised by its hoarse, protective tone. It is. The woman took another step, her black silk skirts whispering against the dry weeds. Then why are you here? Who are you? There was an accusation in the question, an implication of trespass that made Clara's spine straighten. This was her place, her grief. I could ask you the same thing, she retorted, her chin lifting. Dressing like that. This is a graveyard, not a masquerade. The woman flinched as if struck. She pulled the veil from her face with a sharp, jerky movement, revealing features of astonishing, porcelain beauty, now marred by anguish. Her eyes, a startling shade of violet, were swimming with unshed tears. I am no masquerader, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of indignation and heartbreak. My name is Lillian Croft, and I am here to mourn my fiancé. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. Fiancé. Clara felt a cold dread seep into her bones, chilling her more than any winter wind. It was a word of rings and promises, of public declarations and legal documents. It was a word that belonged to a world Eli had never shared with her. Theirs had been a world of whispered secrets and shadowed corners. You're mistaken, Clara said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. Eli, he had no fiancé. She said it with certainty, because to believe otherwise was to admit that the entire foundation of her secret happiness was built on a lie. Lillian let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. It was a terrible, broken noise. She reached into a small reticule that hung from her wrist and pulled out a folded piece of paper and a small, silver locket. Mistaken? She repeated, her voice rising. He wrote to me every week for the past year. He asked me to be his wife in this very letter. She shook the paper, her hand trembling violently. He sent me this locket with his likeness inside. He told me to come to Harmony Creek, that we would build a life here. I traveled for 2 months to get to him. I arrived this morning, wearing my wedding dress as a hopeful jest, only to be told that my groom was dead, that he was buried on this hill. Her gaze dropped back to the grave, and then to the white roses Clara had placed there. A new emotion entered her eyes, a sharp, cold glint of suspicion that cut through her grief. So I will ask you again, Lillian said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Who are you, and what right do you have to place flowers on the grave of the man I was going to marry? The world tilted on its axis. The wind howled in Clara's ears, and the sun seemed to dim. Every memory she had cherished of Eli, every quiet moment, every shared look, every secret touch was suddenly tainted, thrown into a harsh, uncertain light. She looked at this beautiful, grieving woman in her macabre wedding gown, a woman who had come from a different world, clutching letters and lockets, clutching promises Clara had never known existed. 2 women, 1 grave, and the shattering realization that the man they both loved, the man each believed was hers and hers alone, had been living a life far more secret than either of them could ever have imagined. The air on Watcher's Hill grew thick and heavy, a chasm of silence opening between them, filled with the ghosts of unspoken questions and the echoes of a devastating betrayal. The memory was a raw, exposed thing, and the name Lillian Croft was the salt rubbed into the wound. To understand the depth of that wound, one had to go back a year, back to a time when Eli Stone was just a quiet presence at the edge of Clara's world, and her loneliness was a constant, familiar companion. Clara's life before Eli was a study in isolation. She lived on a small, hardscrabble farmstead a mile from Harmony Creek, a place her late husband, Jedediah Thompson, had won in a poker game and then proceeded to run into the ground. When Jedediah was arrested for selling government land scrip he'd forged, the town had turned its back on him. When he died of jail fever a year later, that shunning transferred seamlessly to her, She was no longer Clara May, the girl from Ohio who had come west with hopeful eyes. She was Thompson's widow, and the name was spoken like a curse. The women of the town would gather their skirts and cross the street when they saw her coming. At the general store, Mr. Henderson would serve her in stony silence, counting her coins as if they might be counterfeit. 2. The children were forbidden to go near the trader's farm. Her existence was a testament to her husband's sin, and the town's piety demanded a scapegoat. So Clara learned to live within the walls of their judgment. She worked her land with a ferocity born of desperation, her hands cracked and bleeding, her back aching. The farm was her penance and her fortress, the one place where she could be herself, away from the whispers and the cold stares. Eli Stone was different. His family, the Stones, owned the sprawling cattle ranch that bordered her small property to the north. They were respected, foundational folk. Eli could have joined the chorus of condemnation. It would have been the easy thing to do. He did not. He started appearing one Tuesday in late spring. Clara was trying to wrestle a rotted fence post out of the unyielding earth, her muscles screaming in protest, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up, squinting into the sun, to see him sitting atop his roan, watching her. He didn't speak. He just dismounted, took the shovel from her unresisting hands, and with a few powerful movements, leveraged the post from its hole. He then retrieved a fresh post from his saddle, set it, and tamped the earth around it until it stood firm and true. He gave a single, decisive nod, mounted his horse, and rode away. It became a pattern. He would appear, sometimes once a week, sometimes more, and wordlessly attend to a task that was beyond her strength. He rehung the heavy barn door that had come off its hinges, patched a leak in her cabin roof, and helped her round up a stubborn goat that had bolted for the hills. He never asked for anything in return. Not food, not water, not even a thank you, though she always offered. He simply saw a need and met it. His silence was a balm. It was not the cold, judgmental silence of the townsfolk, but a comfortable, respectful quiet. It was the silence of a man who understood that some things didn't need words. He never mentioned Jedediah. He never asked how she was managing. He never offered pity. He offered only the solid, undeniable fact of his help, in his quiet presence. She was not Thompson's widow. She was simply a woman working her land. This unspoken respect was more precious to her than gold. She began to look for the site of his roan on the ridge, and the steady, quiet rhythm of his work became a fixed point in her chaotic life. Then came the storm. It rolled in from the north in late autumn, a monstrous, bruised purple cloud that swallowed the sun and plunged the afternoon into a premature twilight. The temperature plummeted, and the wind began to howl, a low, guttural moan that grew into a terrifying shriek. It was a blue norther, the kind of storm that could strip a place down to its bones. Eli had been there that afternoon, helping her secure a loose section of the barn's tin roof before the storm hit. They worked against the rising wind, shouting to be heard over its roar. Just as they were driving the last nail, a savage gust tore a heavy, half-rotten beam from the barn's loft. Eli shoved her out of the way, taking the blow himself. It wasn't a direct hit, but the end of the beam caught him high on the shoulder, sending him stumbling backward into a pile of discarded tools. He went down with a sharp cry of pain. Clara scrambled to his side. He was trying to push himself up, his face pale and tight with pain. A dark, ugly gash was welling with blood just below his collarbone where a sharp piece of metal had sliced him, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. "It's my shoulder," he grunted, his voice strained. "Think it's out of joint." The rain began then, not as drops, but as a solid, wind-driven sheet of ice-cold water. There was no question of him riding home. Leaning on her, hissing in pain with every step, they fought their way through the maelstrom to the relative safety of her small cabin. Getting him inside was a struggle. His solid weight against her was a new and startling intimacy. The scent of rain, hoarse and his own clean sweat filled her senses. She managed to get him into the single wooden chair by the hearth and bolted the door against the raging storm. The world outside ceased to exist. Inside. The cabin was a small bubble of flickering light and relative quiet. The wind rattled the window panes and screamed down the chimney, and the rain lashed against the roof like a frantic drumbeat. Far off, the mournful howl of a wolf pack rose and fell with the gale, a stark reminder of the unforgiving wilderness that surrounded them. But inside, the fire in the hearth crackled and spat, casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. Clara worked with a focused urgency she didn't know she possessed. She carefully cut away his wet shirt, her fingers brushing against his warm, tense skin. The gash was deep but clean. She washed it with boiled water and whiskey, the only antiseptic she had, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. Her grandmother had taught her to stitch, a skill she'd only ever used on torn feed sacks. Now, with a sterilized needle and thread, she pulled the edges of the wound together with small, neat stitches, her hands surprisingly steady. His shoulder was clearly dislocated. She knew only what she'd seen her father do once for a farmhand. With a deep breath, she braced her foot against his side, took his arm, and with a firm, sharp pull, seated the joint back into its socket. He roared in pain, a raw, animal sound that was quickly swallowed by a groan of relief. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and he slumped in the chair, breathing heavily, his eyes closed. She spent the next hour tending to him. She brought him a cup of hot, weak coffee laced with more whiskey for the pain. She bathed the sweat from his face with a cool, damp cloth. In these moments, their dynamic shifted irrevocably. He was no longer the strong, silent helper. He was vulnerable, hurt, and in her care. And she was no longer the helpless widow. She was his caretaker, his nurse. When she had done all she could, she pulled up her stool and sat opposite him, watching to make sure the bleeding didn't start again. The storm raged on, a relentless assault on the small cabin. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the howling wind. But the silence was different now. It was no longer merely comfortable. It was charged, thick with unspoken things. He opened his eyes and looked at her. It was a look unlike any he had ever given her before. The usual reserve was gone, stripped away by pain and exhaustion. In its place was a raw, unguarded gratitude that went deeper than words. He was truly seeing her, not just as a neighbor to be helped, but as the woman who had just saved him from a far worse fate. And in his eyes, she saw her own reflection, not as a pariah, but as someone capable and strong. It was a look that acknowledged the fragile, flickering life they had created inside the shelter of the cabin, a world apart from the one outside. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She was intensely aware of him, of the breadth of his bare shoulders, the dark hair curling at his nape, the steady rise and fall of his chest. The space between them, warmed by the fire, seemed to shrink, the air growing heavy. It was the shared intimacy of the sick room, the profound connection forged between the wounded and the healer. But beneath that, something else was stirring, something older and more primal. It was the deep, aching loneliness that had been her constant companion for years, suddenly meeting the silent solitude she had always sensed in him. They were two isolated souls, trapped together in the heart of a storm, and a strange, powerful current began to flow between them. It was a pull of pure instinct, a magnetic force that defied reason and the rigid rules of the world outside. He slowly reached out with his good hand and covered hers where it rested on her lap. His touch was warm and firm, a silent question. She didn't pull away. She turned her hand over, her small, work-roughened fingers lacing with his. It was an answer. The boundary they had so carefully maintained for a year simply dissolved. He rose slightly from the chair, his movement slow and deliberate, and she met him halfway. What followed was not a frenzy of passion, but a quiet, desperate coming together. It was a communion of starved senses. a language spoken in held breaths and the gentle pressure of touch. It was the raw, undeniable need to feel another's warmth, to anchor oneself against the terrifying chaos of the world. In the fire-lit shadows of the cabin, surrounded by the storm's fury, they found a brief, profound sanctuary in each other. It was a moment of pure, unvarnished honesty, a rebellion against the solitude that had defined both their lives, as irresistible and as natural as the storm itself. Clara awoke to the cold, clear light of dawn. The storm had passed. The silence was absolute, almost deafening. For a blissful moment, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years, a warmth that had nothing to do with her blankets. Then memory came rushing back, and with it, a wave of ice-cold panic. Guilt, sharp and sickening, flooded her. She was Jedediah Thompson's widow, a name that was synonymous with shame. The town had judged her, condemned her by association, and in the dark of night, she had proven them right. She had brought a man into her home, into her bed. She had betrayed. What? Not the memory of Jedediah, whom she had feared more than loved. She had betrayed the precarious, fragile peace she had clawed out for herself. She had given the town a real reason to hate her, a sin to pin on her that was her own. The weight of it was suffocating. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. But the space beside her was empty. Eli was already dressed, standing by the door. His injured arm was in a makeshift sling she had made from a dish towel. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the morning light streaming through the window cast him in stark relief. His face was unreadable, his gray eyes shadowed. He looked at her, and for a moment, the intimacy of the night before hung in the air. A fragile, shimmering thing. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. No words could contain what had happened between them. No words could make it right in the harsh light of day. He gave her a single, long look, a look filled with a complex mixture of gratitude, regret, and something else she couldn't name. Then, without a word, he unlatched the door and stepped out into the clean, storm-washed morning, leaving her alone in the crushing silence. The silence on Watcher's Hill stretched taut, a fragile thread about to snap. Lillian Croft's words. "The man I was going to marry," echoed in the wind. A declaration of war on the quiet, private territory of Clara's grief. Clara's first instinct was a fierce, primal denial. It was a lie, a cruel, elaborate fiction spun by a madwoman who had wandered into the wrong cemetery. "That's not possible," Clara stated, her voice flat and hard, a stone wall against the tide of Lillian's emotion. "You don't know what you're talking about." Lillian's beautiful face, already pale with grief, seemed to crumble. The violet eyes flashed with a desperate fire. "Don't know?" she repeated, her voice cracking. "I know the color of his eyes. I know the way his voice sounded on a quiet evening. I know he preferred his coffee black and that he had a small, white scar above his right eyebrow from a fall he took as a boy. Do you know that?" The detail, so specific and true, was a physical blow. Clara did know that scar. She had traced it with her finger one night by the fire. The blood drained from her face, but she held her ground, her disbelief a shield. Anyone could know such things. He was a known man in this town. "But they would not know this," Lillian said, her trembling fingers opening the small silver locket she had produced earlier. She held it out. It was not a gesture of offering, but of proof, an ultimatum. Clara's gaze was drawn to it against her will. The silver was tarnished, but the hinge was sound. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a tiny, hand-tinted photograph, a formal miniature. It was Eli, but it was an Eli she had never seen. He was wearing a stiff collar and a dark coat, his hair combed neatly. He was looking not at the artist, but slightly away, and on his lips was the ghost of a smile. a soft, almost tender expression that she had never been gifted. This was not the weary, dust-covered cowboy who mended her fences. This was someone else's Eli, a promised Eli. Seeing it, Clara felt the first hairline crack appear in her wall of denial. Lillian saw the change in her expression and pressed on, her story tumbling out of her in a torrent of grief and desperation, as if holding it in any longer would drown her. "My name is Lillian Croft. My father is a shipping magnate in Boston. We do not want for anything." She said this not as a boast, but as a statement of fact, a way to explain the chasm between her world and this one. "A year and a half ago, I found myself in some trouble," she continued, her gaze dropping, a faint blush staining her pale cheeks. "A matter of the heart. I had formed an attachment to a man my father deemed unsuitable, a tutor, to avoid a scandal that would tarnish the family name. My father sent me west, to stay with a distant cousin of my mother's who lived in a town 2 days' ride from here. It was a genteel exile, meant to last until the gossip in Boston died down." Clara listened, her arms wrapped tightly around her own waist. A rich girl's problems, a world of scandals and tutors and shipping magnates. It had nothing to do with Eli, nothing to do with the hard, real life they had shared. "I was not made for this land," Lillian admitted, a touch of self-deprecation in her tone. "It terrified me, the emptiness, the sounds at night. One afternoon, I went riding, foolishly, without a guide. I was determined to prove my own mettle. I became lost, hopelessly, terrifyingly lost. My horse threw a shoe, the sun was setting, and I was certain I would perish out there." Her eyes lifted, finding Clara's again, and in them was the clear, sharp memory of that fear. And then he appeared, like an answer to a prayer I didn't know I'd offered. Eli. He wasn't like the men I knew. He didn't preen or posture, he was just capable. He calmed my horse. Then he calmed me. He spoke very little, but I felt safer in his presence than I had in my entire life. He led me back to my cousin's house, and before he left, I asked him his name. He just tipped his hat and said, "Eli Stone, ma'am." Clara's heart twisted. She could picture the scene perfectly. Eli's quiet competence, his lack of fuss. It was the same way he had come into her life. The realization was another chip in her armor. "I couldn't get him out of my mind," Lillian went on, her voice softening, losing its brittle edge and taking on a dreamy, far-away quality. "He was everything the men in Boston were not. He was real. I wrote him a letter, a formal thank you, and had my cousin's ranch hand deliver it to the Stone Ranch. I never expected a reply." She clutched the folded, worn letter she held in her other hand. "But he did reply. His first letter was only 4 lines long. His handwriting was rough, but his words were clear. He said he was glad I was safe and that I should be more careful in the future." A small, sad smile touched her lips. I wrote back, and he did, too. For over a year, we wrote to each other, in secret. My cousin disapproved, so I had the ranch hand carry our letters back and forth. In his letters, he told me about his world, about the cattle drives, the changing of the seasons, the way the sky looked before a storm. He had a poet's heart, hidden beneath a cowboy's rough exterior. He made this harsh land sound like the most beautiful place on earth. A poet's heart. The phrase was a dagger in Clara's chest. Her Eli had communicated in silence, in deeds. He had never once written her a line. Had he been saving his words for this other woman, this Lillian? "And I wrote to him about my world," Lillian said. "About how I felt trapped in a gilded cage, about my hopes and my fears. I told him everything. He was the only person I had ever been truly honest with. In his letters, he began to call me his Eastern Star, the one bright, fixed point in his sky. And I fell in love with him." She unfolded the letter. 3 months ago, my father wrote to me. The gossip in Boston had faded, but he had arranged a marriage for me to a business associate of his. A man twice my age with cold eyes and damp hands. My father commanded me to return home to be wed. I was devastated. I wrote to Eli and told him everything. I told him I would rather die than marry that man." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "This was his reply." She held the letter out so Clara could see the scrawled, familiar handwriting. He wrote, "Then come here. Come to Harmony Creek and be my wife. We don't have much, but we will have each other. That is enough for me." He proposed to me. In this letter, he promised me a life here. The world swayed beneath Clara's feet. Be my wife. The words were a brand, searing themselves into her mind. The moments she had shared with Eli, the raw, desperate intimacy in her cabin on the night of the storm. Had that happened before or after he wrote these words? The question was poison. "So I made my choice," Lillian said, her chin lifting with a defiant pride. "I took the money my father sent for my passage home, but instead of buying a ticket to Boston, I used it to come here. I packed my belongings, and this," she gestured to her black dress. "It was meant to be my wedding dress. I had it made in secret. I chose black as a final act of rebellion against my family, a symbol that I was shedding my old life. I wanted to arrive and surprise him, to walk into his arms as his bride." Tears finally spilled from her eyes, tracing clean paths down her dusty cheeks. "I spent 2 months on trains and stagecoaches, dreaming of his face. I arrived in town this morning. I asked for Eli Stone, the sheriff, a kind man with sad eyes, told me I would find him up here, on Watcher's Hill." She looked at the grave, her body racked with a silent, terrible sob. "I came to be a bride, but death made me a widow before the vows were even spoken. This dress, it was my hope. Now, it is my mourning shroud." The story was complete. It was fantastical, romantic, and utterly, horribly believable. Every detail, every word, rang with a bitter clarity of truth. The locket, the letter, the scar above his eye, the black wedding dress. It all fit together. A perfect, heartbreaking narrative that had no place for a lonely widow on a hardscrabble farm. Clara felt a strange, cold detachment settle over her, as if she were floating above her own body, watching this tragedy unfold. She saw herself, a simple woman in a faded dress, and she saw Lillian, a dramatic figure of Eastern wealth and sorrow, and between them lay the grave of a man who had apparently been vast enough, or deceitful enough, to contain 2 separate worlds, 2 separate loves. Eli had lived a double life. To Lillian, he was the romantic hero, the gallant rescuer, the poet cowboy who offered escape and a life of authentic love, sealed with a written promise of marriage. To Clara, he was the silent protector, the quiet companion, a fellow outcast who offered comfort and solace not in words, but in shared hardship and a stolen, stormy intimacy. He had given Lillian his words, his promises, his future. He had given Clara his time, his help, his body. Which was the greater gift? Which was the greater betrayal? The cold detachment shattered, and in its place, a maelstrom of emotion rose up, so violent it threatened to tear her apart. First came the anger, a hot, white rage. Anger at Eli. How dare he? How dare he come to her, share her fire, her food, her bed, while writing love letters to another woman? How dare he let her believe that their secret world was unique, that his quiet attention was reserved for her alone? He had used her. He had taken the comfort she offered while his heart and his promises belonged elsewhere. Then came the jealousy, a vile, green-eyed monster that clawed at her insides. It was a jealousy of Lillian's beauty, of her refined speech, of her tragic, romantic story. Lillian had received letters calling her an Eastern star. Clara had received mended fences and a silent departure in the gray light of dawn. Lillian had been offered a future as his wife. Clara had been given a single night that left her riddled with guilt and shame. And beneath it all, an ocean of sorrow. so deep and vast it threatened to swallow her whole. The grief she felt was no longer the clean, sharp pain of loss. It was now a muddied, poisoned thing. She was not just mourning the man who died. She was mourning the man who had never truly been hers at all. She had not been a secret, cherished love. She had been a secret of a different kind. The other woman, the convenient comfort, the trader's widow who would ask for nothing and to whom nothing needed to be promised. She looked at Lillian, who was now weeping openly, her shoulders shaking, a figure of pure, unadulterated heartbreak, and Clara felt no pity, only a bitter, shared sense of ruin. She had come to this grave to mourn her hero, her secret love. But now, standing before the cold earth, she realized she was not the only one, and in that shared space of grief, there was no comfort, only the sharp, cutting edges of a love that had been divided, and a truth that had left them both utterly, irrevocably alone. The walk down from Watcher's Hill was a silent ordeal. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy stillness in the air that was more oppressive than its howling. Clara led the way, her steps sure and familiar on the worn path. Lillian followed, her black silk dress, so alien and dramatic against the landscape, catching on thorns and gathering a hem of fine, red dust. They were two planets of grief, locked in a strange, unwilling orbit around the memory of a dead man. The space between them charged with unspoken accusations and the raw, gaping wound of a shared betrayal. By the time they reached the edge of Harmony Creek, the afternoon sun was beginning to dip, painting the dusty main street in hues of orange and long shadow. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. The town, which had settled into its late afternoon lull, stirred as if poked with a stick. Mr. Henderson, sweeping the boardwalk in front of his general store, stopped mid-sweep, his mouth falling slightly agape. A group of women clustered by the water pump ceased their chatter, their heads turning in unison. Even the horses tied to the hitching posts seemed to perk their ears. A woman in a black wedding dress was a spectacle. That same woman walking alongside the town pariah, the trader's widow, was the stuff of a legend before it had even happened. The whispers started immediately, a rustle of dry leaves that followed them down the street. Who is that? Look at her dress. What's she doing with the Thompson woman? The gossip found fertile ground and sprouted instantly. By the time Clara pushed open the door to the sheriff's office, the story was already taking root all over town. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary face seemed carved from the same rugged landscape, looked up from his paperwork. His eyes, kind but tired, took in the sight of the two women, one he knew as a figure of quiet tragedy, the other a vision of gothic sorrow, and he sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Ma'am," he added, nodding to Lillian. "She needs a room at the hotel," Clara stated, her voice devoid of emotion. It was a practical problem to be solved. Lillian, who had been a silent, ghostly presence, finally spoke, her voice thin but clear. "And I need to know when the next stagecoach leaves, for anywhere east." Sheriff Brody's gaze softened with pity. "The stage came through this morning. Ma'am, next one's not for 3 days." He'd been the one to break the news of Eli's death to her, a task he wouldn't soon forget. "The hotel can put you up. It's clean, at least." As they stood there, the door swung open again and Martha Henderson, the storekeeper's wife and the town's chief purveyor of opinion, bustled in, a basket on her arm. She stopped short, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. Her gaze flickered from Lillian's funereal finery to Clara's stony face, and a look of sharp, avid curiosity settled on her features. "Well, I declare," she said, her voice carrying a note of feigned sympathy that barely veiled her excitement. "The whole town is buzzing. 2 widows for 1 man. It's a tragedy, a terrible, confusing tragedy." The words, spoken aloud, were brutal. 2 widows. It gave their strange, awful situation a name, a label for the town to examine and dissect. Clara flinched, her hands clenching into fists. "That's enough, Martha," the sheriff said, his tone quiet but firm. "These ladies have been through enough for one day." Martha sniffed, undeterred. "Of course, Sheriff, it's just some of us feel for the poor girl," she said, gesturing to Lillian. "An innocent bride, coming all this way for her wedding day, and some of us," she added, her eyes cutting to Clara, "can't help but remember that trouble has a way of following some folks." The town's opinion, delivered in one neat, cruel package. Sympathy was for the beautiful, tragic stranger. For Clara, there was only the lingering stain of her past, a confirmation of her inherent unworthiness. The old shame, the familiar sting of judgment, coiled in Clara's gut. Lillian, pale and trembling, seemed to shrink under the woman's gaze. I think I will just wait at the stagecoach office," she murmured, turning to leave, her only instinct to flee this town and its prying eyes. She took 2 steps toward the door, a solitary figure of despair, a ship ready to cast off its lines and drift into oblivion. And in that moment, something shifted in Clara. It was not pity. Pity was a luxury she couldn't afford, and a sentiment she would have despised receiving herself. It was something else, a strong, formless impulse that rose from the depths of her own desolation. To let this woman go was to let the only other piece of Eli's puzzle walk away forever. Lillian was the keeper of the letters, the promises, the part of Eli that existed in words and dreams. To let her leave was to be left alone with her own silent, incomplete memories. It was an unbearable thought. This stranger, this rival, was now the only other person on earth who understood the precise shape of the hole Eli had left behind. "Wait," Clara said, the word rough, almost a command. Lillian stopped, her back still to Clara. "The stage isn't for 3 days," Clara stated, repeating the sheriff's words. "There's no sense in you sitting at the depot. It's not safe." She took a breath, the next words tasting like ash in her mouth. "You can stay with me. My cabin is small, but it's warm, and no one will bother you there." The sheriff looked at Clara, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Martha Henderson's jaw practically hit the floor. Lillian turned slowly, her violet eyes wide with disbelief, searching Clara's face for the trick, the hidden motive. She found none, only a kind of grim, stubborn resolve. The days that followed were a torment of suffocating silence. Clara's cabin, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, too small to contain the 2 of them and the enormous ghost of the man who stood between them. Lillian was a creature of a different world. She moved with a quiet grace that was at odds with the cabin's rustic simplicity. She folded her silk dress as if it were a sacred relic and wore one of Clara's spare, rough-spun dresses, which hung on her slender frame. They moved around each other with the careful, wary distance of 2 wolves forced to share a den. The silence was broken only by the necessities of existence. The fire needs wood. The water bucket is low. Every object in the small space was a potential landmine. Clara would pick up the tin coffee cup Eli had used, and she would see Lillian's eyes fix on it, her expression unreadable. Lillian would hum a tune, a sad, classical air, and Clara would feel a surge of resentment at the intrusion of this alien sound into her quiet world. The dam of silence broke, as it had to. 4 days into their strange cohabitation, Clara was cleaning a newly repaired leather harness, the one Eli had fixed for her just a month before his death. She ran her thumb over the neat, strong stitching. "He had good hands," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Strong. He could fix anything." Across the small room, Lillian looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read. "He wrote to me about his hands," she said, her voice soft. "He said he worried they were too rough. He worried I would find them coarse, after being used to the soft hands of gentlemen in Boston. Clara's fingers tightened on the leather. "He never said anything like that to me. He said in his letters that he found it easier to write his feelings than to speak them." Lillian countered, a defensive edge to her voice. "He said the silence of the plains taught him to keep his thoughts to himself. But the page was a place he could be free." It had begun, the quiet, undeclared competition. A battle of memories waged across the small, fire-lit cabin. Each woman presented her evidence, her proof of love. Searching for the clue that would prove her claim was the stronger one. Clara offered the tangible, "He once spent a whole day helping me pull a calf from a mud pit. He didn't leave until the animal was safe and warm in the barn, even though a storm was rolling in. He never complained." Her Eli was a man of selfless action. Lillian countered with the ethereal, "He once wrote me a 3-page letter describing a sunset he'd watched from the top of a mesa. He said the colors made him think of what heaven might look like, and it made him less afraid of dying, because he knew such beauty existed. He said he wished I was there to see it with him." Her Eli was a man of poetic introspection. Clara, "He never laughed out loud, but sometimes, when my old mule did something stubborn, he'd get this look in his eyes, and the corner of his mouth would twitch. That was his laugh." She had the secret, intimate knowledge of his habits. Lillian, "He told me he wanted 2 sons and a daughter. He had their names picked out, Samuel for his father, Thomas for his favorite author, and Rose, because he said a woman as beautiful as me deserved to have a flower for a daughter." She had his dreams for the future. It was a cruel, painful exercise. Every memory Lillian shared felt like a thorn in Clara's heart, a testament to the secret, romantic world he had hidden from her. And every practical, earthly memory Clara offered seemed to make Lillian's eyes fill with a fresh wave of sorrow for the real, day-to-day man she had never had the chance to know. Slowly, painfully, they began to realize there was no victory to be had. No memory was greater than another. They were just 2 different sides of the same, complex man. The competition softened, the sharp edges of their rivalry worn down by the constant friction of shared grief. The purpose shifted. They were no longer trying to prove who he loved more. They were simply trying to assemble a complete picture of the man they had both lost, piecing him together from their disparate, broken fragments. One night, the wind kicked up again, howling around the small cabin with a familiar, mournful cry that reminded Clara of the night of the storm. The moon was a cold, silver disk in a sea of racing clouds. A chill had seeped into the cabin that the fire couldn't quite chase away. The weight of the past week, of the town's stairs and their own private war of memories, had become unbearable. Clara uncorked the bottle of whiskey she kept for snake bites and toothaches. She poured a generous measure into 2 tin cups and pushed one across the table to Lillian without a word. Lillian looked at it, then at Clara, and accepted. They drank in silence for a time. The only sounds the wind and the crackling fire. The whiskey was harsh and raw, and it burned a trail of warmth down their throats. "I hate him sometimes," Clara said suddenly, staring into the flames. The admission felt like a betrayal and a relief. "I hate him for lying." Lillian nodded, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "I hate him for his promises," she whispered, "for making me believe in a future that was never real. Was any of it real?" "The way he fixed my fence was real," Clara said, her voice thick. "The way he brought me supplies from town when I was sick was real. The way he called me his Eastern Star felt real." Lillian choked out, a single tear tracing a path down her face. "The way he said my letters were the only thing that kept the loneliness at bay, that felt real." And with that, the dam broke. Lillian's tear was followed by another, and soon she was covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The sight of her raw, unguarded grief resonated with the storm in Clara's own chest. The anger, the jealousy, the profound, unending sorrow. It all came boiling to the surface. A strangled sob escaped her own lips, and soon She too was weeping. They cried for the man they had loved and lost. They cried for the lies he had told. They cried for the women they had been before his ghost had bound them together. They cried for their own desperate loneliness, a loneliness that was now reflected, perfectly and horribly, in the eyes of their rival. In the midst of that shared, desolate storm of weeping, Clara felt a hesitant touch on her arm. She looked up through her tears. Lillian had reached across the small space between them, her hand resting on Clara's sleeve. It was a simple, fragile gesture of comfort, the first of its kind between them. Something inside Clara, a knot of resentment she had been holding for days, finally let go. On pure instinct, she leaned forward, and Lillian met her halfway. They clung to each other, a clumsy, desperate embrace fueled by whiskey and sorrow. It was not an embrace of friendship or affection. It was the frantic clutching of two people adrift in a dark, cold sea, finding the only other piece of wreckage in the storm. Lillian was all sharp angles and the scent of lavender soap, a foreign presence. Clara was solid, smelling of wood smoke and earth. They held each other and wept, their tears dampening each other's shoulders. And in that moment of absolute vulnerability, with all their defenses washed away, something new and terrifying sparked in the darkness, the intense, anchorless emotions, the longing, the anger, the love they both felt for Eli, were swirling in the space between them. The embrace tightened, and grief, for a moment, transformed into something else. It was a desperate, human need for warmth, for life, in a house that had become a shrine to death. It was the shock of feeling a living, breathing body against her own. As they pulled back slightly, their faces were inches apart, their eyes meeting in the dim, flickering firelight. The air grew thick, charged with something fiery and unexpected. It was a moment that defied logic, a moment born of profound confusion and shared pain. A boundary was crossed, not with a whisper, but with a silent, consuming spark that left them both breathless and terrified in the howling dark. The cold, gray light of dawn was an unwelcome intruder, laying bare the consequences of the night before. In the hearth, the fire had died, leaving a pile of pale, skeletal ash. A chill permeated the small cabin, a cold that had nothing to do with the morning air. Clara was awake long before the sun crested the hills, her body rigid, her mind a chaotic battlefield. Shame was a physical thing, a hot, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. What had they done? It was a transgression, an act so far outside the bounds of reason and decency that she couldn't even give it a name. It was born of whiskey and grief, a moment of madness in the dark. But that wasn't the whole truth, and that was the part that terrified her. Beneath the shame, a small, illicit ember of memory glowed, the desperate, undeniable warmth of another person, the startling discovery of softness in a life defined by hardship. A treacherous, unwanted desire flickered in the shadow of her guilt. She rose from her cot, moving with a stiff, deliberate quiet. Across the small room, Lillian was also awake, a still, pale figure in the gloom. Her dark hair was a wild tangle around her face, and her violet eyes, when they briefly met Clara's, were wide and haunted. An electric current of shared memory and mutual horror passed between them. Lillian immediately looked away, her cheeks flushing a deep crimson. The silence of the previous days had been heavy. This new silence was suffocating. Clara couldn't look at her. To look at Lillian was to see her own sin reflected back at her. She was Thompson's widow. The brand was seared into her soul. First, she had dishonored her widowhood with Eli, a secret she had carried with a mixture of guilt and joy. Now this, a new, far stranger, and more damnable secret. She felt irredeemably fallen. She busied herself with the morning chores with a frantic energy, stoking the fire, fetching water, her movements jerky and loud in the tense quiet. Lillian, after a long moment, rose and began to fold her blankets with a precise, careful touch, as if the small, ordered action could somehow put their chaotic world back together. They didn't speak a word. The sharp, aggressive rap on the cabin door was a violent intrusion. Both women froze, their eyes meeting in a shared flash of alarm before quickly darting away again. It was too early for visitors. Visitors of any kind were rare. Visitors at this hour meant trouble. Clara wiped her suddenly damp palms on her dress and unlatched the door. 3 men stood on her porch. The one in the lead was Silas Blackwood, a local land speculator with a reputation for being as grasping as the rocky soil he dealt in. His eyes were small and close-set, and they missed nothing. Flanking him were 2 hired men, large and impassive, their presence a clear and deliberate intimidation. "Mornin', widow," Blackwood said, his voice slick with a false congeniality that set Clara's teeth on edge. He tipped his hat, but his eyes were already scanning the interior of the cabin, cataloging her meager possessions before they landed on Lillian. A flicker of surprise and then renewed interest in his gaze. "What do you want, Silas?" Clara asked, her body blocking the doorway. "Just a business matter," he said, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "It has come to my attention, through certain legal channels, that the title to this parcel of land is unresolved. Your late husband, Jedediah Thompson, acquired it under circumstances the law finds questionable. His name is on the bill of sale. It's true, but with him being a convicted federal criminal, and the original deed holder having moved on years ago, the town council has been petitioned to declare the title forfeit." Clara's blood ran cold. "This is my land. I've worked it for 3 years. "You've been squatting on it for 3 years. Is the legal term," Blackwood corrected her smoothly. "Possession is an ownership, not without a clear and legal title in your own name. I've made an offer to the council, a generous one, to purchase this land and put it to productive use." He smiled, a thin, unpleasant stretching of his lips. "They've accepted. I'm here to inform you that you have until the end of the week to vacate the premises." The world tilted. Vacate. Leave. To go where? This small, hard piece of earth was everything. It was her home, her work, her prison, her identity. To be cast off, it was to be erased. "You can't," she whispered, the words barely audible. "The bill of sale is in your husband's name, a traitor's name. It's worthless paper." "Clara," he said, his voice hardening, the false kindness gone. "Unless you can produce a registered title deed in your own name, you have no claim. Now, we can do this easy, or we can do this hard." He gestured to the 2 men behind him. Panic, stark and absolute, seized her. She was alone. Eli was gone. The town despised her. There was no one to stand for her. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a cold, hollow despair. And then a new voice cut through the morning air, a voice as crisp and sharp as breaking ice. "And under whose legal jurisdiction does this town council operate? Mr. Blackwood?" Lillian stepped forward, moving to stand just behind Clara's shoulder. She was no longer the pale, shaken girl of a moment ago. Her spine was straight, her head held high, and her eyes, fixed on Blackwood, burned with a cold, aristocratic fire. The rough-spun dress couldn't hide the sudden, formidable authority she projected. Blackwood was taken aback. "What's that to you, Missy?" "You will address me as Miss Croft," Lillian stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "My father is Alistair Croft, of the Boston firm Croft & Sons Shipping. His legal counsel is the firm of Davies, Peabody, and Finch, who, I assure you, have a very keen interest in the proper application of federal and territorial law, particularly where it concerns the unlawful seizure of property." The names, so foreign and powerful, hung in the air. Blackwood's smug expression faltered. "This is a local matter. Boston law has no place here." "On the contrary," Lillian continued, her voice cutting like a razor, "any land transaction is subject to territorial law, which is beholden to federal statute. An attempt to seize property without due process, without a formal court order from a territorial judge, is illegal. A town council's petition is not a legal order. It is, at best, a suggestion. At worst. She took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. It is a criminal conspiracy to defraud a widow of her home, a story that I am certain the newspapers back east would find quite compelling. She was magnificent. Clara stared at her, mesmerized. This was not the grieving fiancé or the confused partner in a moment of mad grief. This was a woman of power, wielding weapons Clara didn't even know existed, words, law, and the unassailable confidence of a privileged birth. Blackwood was flustered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Now, see here." "No, you see here, sir," Lillian interrupted. "You will leave this property immediately. I will be dispatching a telegram to my father's attorneys this afternoon. If you or any of your men set foot on this land again before this matter is settled by a legitimate court, I will personally see to it that they bring the full weight of the United States legal system down on this town, and on you specifically. Do I make myself clear?" For a long moment, Silas Blackwood stared at her, his little eyes blinking. He looked from Lillian's unyielding face to Clara's stunned one, and then at his two hired men, who suddenly seemed less like intimidating brutes and more like confused cattle. He had come to bully a lone, despised widow. He had not expected to face a Boston heiress with an arsenal of lawyers at her command. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. A final, impotent act of defiance. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the threat was hollow. He turned on his heel and stomped off, his men trailing behind him. When they were gone, a profound silence descended. Lillian's rigid posture suddenly slumped. She swayed, and Clara reached out instinctively, her hand closing around Lillian's arm to steady her. The contact was electric, a jolting reminder of the night before, but this time it was grounded in something new, a fierce, startling wave of gratitude. "Thank you," Clara breathed, the words inadequate. Lillian nodded, not looking at her. "It was nothing," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Just words." They were the right words. Clara said, I wouldn't have known what to say, and I wouldn't know how to fix a fence." Lillian replied, a wry, exhausted smile touching her lips. "It seems we both have our uses." That morning, a truce was forged. Not in words, but in action. Their shared guilt and confusion were pushed aside by a new, more urgent reality: survival. Lillian wrote her telegram, a long, detailed missive filled with legal terms. Clara rode to the next town over to send it, a 2-hour journey each way. While she was gone, Lillian, to Clara's astonishment, had mucked out the chicken coop and gathered the eggs. They fell into a new rhythm. They were no longer two women mourning a man. They were partners in a fight. They worked from sunup to sundown, driven by the shared threat of losing the farm. They mended the section of fence Blackwood's men had deliberately kicked down on their way out. Clara showed Lillian how to stretch the wire, how to hammer in the staples. Lillian, though her hands were soft and unaccustomed to the labor, worked without complaint, her brow furrowed in concentration. They worked together in the parched vegetable garden, pulling weeds and carrying buckets of water from the well, and in the heat of the afternoons, when the sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, Clara took down Jedediah's old rifle. "If they come back," Clara said, her voice grim, "words might not be enough next time. You need to know how to use this." The rifle was heavy and awkward in Lillian's arms, but she stood her ground, her jaw set. Clara stood behind her, adjusting her stance, her hands briefly on Lillian's waist, her arms guiding Lillian's to show her how to sight down the barrel. The physical contact was practical, necessary, but beneath it, the memory of their embrace hummed like a plucked string. The first time Lillian fired, the recoil sent her stumbling back, her eyes wide with shock. The second time. She held firm. By the end of the week, she could hit a tin can from 50 paces. A grim satisfaction settled over them. They were no longer helpless. They rode out together to check the property lines. Clara on her mule, Lillian on a gentle mare borrowed from the livery, under the vast, bleached sky. They moved as a unit through the scorched landscape. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer the tense, awkward silence of shame, but the comfortable, easy silence of two people who understood each other without needing to speak. A glance, a nod, a shared look at a hawk circling overhead. It was a new language they were building, one of deeds and shared purpose. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of target practice under the relentless sun, Clara felt a chill despite the warmth of the cabin. By nightfall, she was shivering violently, her teeth chattering. The sun had taken its toll. A fever had set in, hot and fierce. She slumped onto her cot, her body aching, her mind drifting in and out of a feverish haze. She was vaguely aware of Lillian's cool hand on her forehead, of the scent of lavender soap. "It's the sun," she mumbled. "Too much." "Hush now," Lillian's voice said, soft but firm, coming from a great distance. "Just rest." The night became a blur of disjointed images and sensations for Clara. She was back on Watcher's Hill, the wind screaming in her ears. She was a child again, her mother humming a lullaby. She felt the heavy weight of Eli's body, the rough texture of his shirt, then the impossible softness of Lillian's skin. Guilt and desire, past and present, tangled in her delirious thoughts. Through it all, one constant presence remained. Lillian, a cool cloth on her burning face, a cup of water held to her chapped lips, a steady hand on her shoulder when the shivers became too violent. Lillian sat by her side all night, her shadow a constant, watchful presence in the flickering lamplight. She didn't sleep. She just stayed. Clara's fever broke just before dawn. The shivering stopped, and the searing heat in her body receded, leaving her weak, drenched in sweat, but clear-headed. She opened her eyes. Lillian was slumped in the chair beside the cot, her head resting on her arms, fast asleep. Her face, in the soft, pre-dawn light, was stripped of its usual guardedness. She looked young and exhausted, but peaceful. A lock of dark hair had fallen across her cheek. Clara lay there, watching her. This woman, this stranger, this rival, this heiress from another world, had faced down a land thief for her. She had mucked out her coop, mended her fences, learned to shoot a rifle for her, and she had sat by her side all night, nursing her through a fever. A wave of emotion, so powerful and pure it took her breath away, washed over Clara. It had nothing to do with Eli anymore. The ghost that had stood between them had faded, burned away by the heat of their shared struggle. All that was left was the woman sleeping in the chair. Lillian stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were cloudy with sleep for a moment, then focused on Clara, a look of concern dawning on her face. "Clara, how are you feeling?" "Better," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. "The fever's gone." She pushed herself up on one elbow. "You stayed." Lillian's lips curved into a small, tired smile. "Of course, I stayed." There was nothing more to say. All the confusion, the guilt, the unspoken questions of the past weeks seemed to fall away, leaving only a simple, undeniable truth. Clara reached out, her hand finding Lillian's. Lillian's fingers curled around hers. A perfect fit. Clara leaned in, and Lillian met her. The kiss was nothing like the frantic, grief-stricken collision in the dark. It was soft and hesitant at first, then deepened with a slow, dawning recognition. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of shared survival, of a startling and beautiful new beginning. It tasted of wood smoke and lavender, of dust and determination. It was the quiet confirmation of a love that had, against all odds, taken root and grown in the harshest, most unforgiving soil. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that was as demanding and as steady as the turning of the earth. The fragile intimacy born from fever and fear was a quiet, unspoken thing, a delicate plant taking root in the hard soil of their shared existence. They did not name what had passed between them. In the harsh light of day, it was too new, too strange to be examined. Instead, they nurtured it in the spaces between words, in shared glances across the supper table. In the easy way they now worked side by side, their bodies knowing each other's movements, anticipating each other's needs. The threat of Silas Blackwood and the town council receded, held at bay by the unseen, distant power of Lillian's lawyers. For the first time in years, Clara felt a sense of security on her own land. But it was not the land itself that made her feel secure. It was the woman who now shared it with her. Lillian, with her fierce intelligence and surprising resilience, had become an anchor, and Clara, with her deep, practical knowledge of survival, was the harbor Lillian had never known she needed. They were a strange, effective team. Clara taught Lillian the language of the land, how to read the sky for rain, how to tell good foraging mushrooms from bad, how to soothe a spooked animal. Lillian, in turn, shared parts of her world with Clara. In the evenings, she would read aloud from the one book she had brought with her, a collection of poems by Mr. Keats. Clara, who had never had much time for poetry, found herself captivated by the rich, beautiful words, a balm after a day of hard labor. They were building a life, a small, defiant island of their own making. The ghost of Eli Stone, once a towering presence that filled every corner of the cabin, had receded. He was still there, the foundation of their meeting. But he was no longer the sole object of their grief. He had become a memory they shared, rather than a man they fought over. This fragile peace was shattered on a bright, cool Tuesday morning. He rode in from the north, the direction of the Stone Ranch, but he was not a familiar figure. He was a big man, broader and taller than Eli had been, with the same dark hair but a harder set to his jaw. He rode a powerful bay gelding and sat in the saddle with an air of grim purpose. He dismounted at their fence line and did not wait for an invitation, striding toward the cabin with a long, ground-eating gait. Clara was splitting kindling by the woodpile, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar comfort. Lillian was on the porch, mending a tear in one of Clara's work shirts, her needle moving with a new, practiced skill. Both of them looked up as the man approached, and a shared sense of unease settled over them. "I'm looking for the Thompson place," the man said. It wasn't a question. His eyes, a gray so dark they were almost black, swept over the farmstead, taking in the neatly stacked wood, the repaired fence, the chickens scratching in the yard. His gaze was assessing, critical. "You found it," Clara said, resting the axe head on the chopping block. She stood her ground, her body tensed. The man's eyes moved from her to Lillian, lingering on the fine, aristocratic lines of her face. A flicker of suspicion, or perhaps just confusion, crossed his features. "My name is Caleb Stone," he announced, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Eli was my brother." The name fell between them like a stone dropped into a still pond. Eli's brother. The connection was undeniable. He had the same strong nose, the same way of standing, as if braced against a high wind. But where Eli's presence had been quiet and watchful, this man's was confrontational. He was not here to help. "We're sorry for your loss," Lillian said, her voice soft but steady as she rose from her chair. Caleb's gaze snapped back to her. "Are you?" he asked, the question sharp with disbelief. "The whole town is talking. They say my brother has 2 widows, one of them the wife of a traitor, the other a fancy-dressed stranger from back east. You can imagine my confusion. I've come for answers." His grief was a weapon, sharp and pointed. He was using it to wound, to break through their composure. Clara felt a familiar prickle of anger. "Your brother was a hero," she said, her voice tight. He died protecting this town. He died in a shootout he didn't have to be in, Caleb countered, taking a step closer. Eli was a rancher, not a lawman. I want to know what kept him in Harmony Creek. What business he had that was so important he'd get himself killed for it. His eyes moved deliberately between the two of them. Seems his business was here, with you two. The accusation was clear. They were the reason he was dead. The fragile peace of the morning was gone, replaced by the cold shadow of this man's anger. Eli was a good man, Clara said, her voice low. He was our friend. Friend? Caleb let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. That's not the word I'm hearing. I was at the bank this morning, settling his affairs. He didn't have much, a few dollars to his name. But the banker, he's a talkative fellow. He remembered something interesting. 6 months ago, my brother, who never had 2 cents to rub together, made a withdrawal, a big one, $200. He had it sent by bank draft to a woman. The banker couldn't remember the name, just that the draft was sent to a town 2 days from here. He looked directly at Lillian. A town where, I'm told, a rich young lady from Boston was staying with her cousin. The air went thin. Clara's head snapped toward Lillian. $200. It was a fortune. More money than Clara saw in a year of selling eggs and produce. A cold dread, laced with the bitter poison of suspicion, began to seep into her veins. All of Lillian's talk of love and poetry. Had it been a lie? Had she been taking Eli's money? Lillian's face was chalk white. She looked from Caleb's accusing stare to Clara's stunned, questioning one, and her composure finally broke. Her shoulders slumped, and her eyes filled with a familiar, haunted sorrow. It's true, she whispered, the words barely audible. He sent me the money. The confession, simple and direct, was a physical blow to Clara. She felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The partnership, the trust, the intimacy they had built over the last few weeks. All of it suddenly felt like a house built on sand. Why had Lillian never mentioned this? This huge, significant secret. It was a lie of omission, as damaging as any spoken falsehood. Caleb's face hardened into a mask of grim satisfaction. He had his answer. So that's what it was, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. You were bleeding him dry. What was it? Blackmail? Payment for services rendered? No! Lillian cried, her head snapping up, her eyes flashing with a combination of pain and fury. You don't understand. It wasn't like that. He offered it to me. I told him about my family, about the man they wanted me to marry. I told him I had no way to escape. He sent the money so I could have a new start, so I could come here. To him, he said it was... Her voice broke. He said it was his promise to me, a wedding promise, to show that he would take care of me. A promise he paid for in cash, Caleb sneered. I never used it, Lillian insisted, her voice rising with desperation. She looked at Clara, her eyes pleading for understanding. I couldn't. After he was gone, it felt wrong. It was blood money, the price of a life I never got to have. It's still in my trunk, untouched. But Clara couldn't process the explanation. All she could hear was the fact of the money, $200, while she was struggling to buy seed and feed, fighting to keep from starving. Lillian had a fortune tucked away in her trunk. Lillian, who had seemed like a fellow victim of circumstance, had a safety net all along. The sense of shared struggle, the very foundation of their bond, crumbled into dust. She suddenly saw Lillian not as her partner, but as the rich girl from Boston, a woman who solved her problems with money, her father's or Eli's. It made no difference. The Stone family is not a wealthy one, Caleb said, his voice cold and hard. That $200 was most of Eli's inheritance from our mother. Money he was supposed to use to improve his section of the ranch. He gave you his future. And for what? So you could play dress-up in your fancy black gown? He then turned his cold gaze on Clara. And you, living on this land that doesn't belong to you. My brother spent countless hours here, fixing your fences, patching your roof, wasting his time and our family's resources. For what? So you could lure him away from his responsibilities? The attack was brutal, and it hit its mark. Clara's own deep-seated fears that she was a user, a squatter, a woman who brought trouble to others, rose up to choke her. She had no defense. This farm, Caleb continued, gesturing around them with a sweep of his arm, is soaked in my brother's sweat and paid for with his inheritance. That makes it our family's business. He looked back and forth between them, his face set like granite. As Eli's only surviving family, I am making a claim. This land, this house, half of it belongs to the Stone family. I don't care what some Boston lawyer has to say about it. This is a matter of blood. You will sign over half the title to me, or I will take this to a territorial judge and paint a picture of two conniving women who conspired to defraud my brother of his life and his legacy. And in a town that already despises one of you, he added, looking directly at Clara. Who do you think he'll believe? The threat hung in the air, absolute and terrifying. He was using their secrets, their reputations, and his own grief to tear them apart and take what he wanted. He didn't wait for an answer. I'll be back in 2 days with a legal document drawn up by the town clerk, he said. Be ready to sign it. He turned and strode back to his horse, leaving a wake of devastation behind him. When he was gone, the silence that returned was a dead, cold thing. It was a silence of broken trust. Clara couldn't bring herself to look at Lillian. She felt a burning, irrational anger. Anger that Lillian had kept such a secret. Anger that this secret had given Caleb the weapon he needed to destroy them. She felt foolish, naive. She had allowed herself to trust, to care, and it had all been a lie. Lillian finally broke the silence, her voice a fragile whisper. Clara, I was going to tell you. When? Clara shot back, her voice rough with unshed tears of fury and betrayal. When were you going to tell me? When you were packing your bags to leave me here to deal with him alone? That's not fair, Lillian cried, stung. I didn't tell you because I was ashamed. I was ashamed that my connection to him involved money. I didn't want you to think of me that way. What way? Clara asked, her voice laced with a bitterness that surprised even herself. As the rich girl who can buy her way out of trouble, that's what you are, isn't it? When things get hard, you just write a letter to your father's lawyers or use the money Eli gave you. What do I have? Lillian? I have this dirt, and now his brother is going to take half of it because of you and your secrets. The words were cruel, and as soon as they left her lips, she felt a pang of regret. But she couldn't take them back. She was terrified of losing her home, the only thing she had left in the world, and in her terror, she lashed out at the only person there. Lillian recoiled as if she'd been slapped. A shuttered, guarded look came over her face, the same look she'd worn when she first arrived. The vulnerable woman who had wept in Clara's arms was gone, replaced once again by the cool, distant Miss Croft of Boston. I see, she said, her voice turning brittle and cold. You believe I used him, just as his brother does, just as my father always believed everyone was using him for his money. She gave a small, humorless laugh. It seems I can't escape it, no matter how far I run. Without another word, she turned and walked back into the cabin, the door closing quietly behind her, shutting Clara out. The easy intimacy, the shared laughter, the quiet comfort, it all vanished. The cabin was once again just a house, and they were once again two strangers, trapped together not by a shared hope, but by a shared, looming disaster. The distance between them was no longer just a few feet of floorboards. It was a vast, cold canyon of suspicion and fear. The 2 days that followed Caleb Stone's ultimatum were a descent into a cold, silent hell. The cabin, once a sanctuary of shared purpose, became a pressure cooker of resentment and fear. Clara and Lillian moved around each other like ghosts, their presence a constant, grating reminder of the wedge that had been driven between them. Every shared meal was choked down in silence. Every task was performed in a grim, solitary fashion. The easy camaraderie they had built was gone, replaced by a chasm of mistrust. Clara was consumed by a toxic brew of emotions. Fear was the bedrock, the raw, gut-wrenching terror of losing her home, but layered on top of it was a searing, irrational jealousy. She imagined Eli writing poetic letters to Lillian while offering her only his silent labor. She pictured the $200, a sum that could have transformed her own desperate existence, sitting in Lillian's trunk. This secret fortune made Lillian seem like a tourist in the landscape of hardship that Clara called home. It made their entire partnership feel like a lie. But beneath the fear and the jealousy was something darker, something she could barely admit to herself. A profound and suffocating guilt, the memory of the night by the fire, of the kiss after her fever, now felt like a terrible sin. She had allowed herself to feel something for this woman, a feeling of tenderness and connection that was utterly forbidden. And now, in the harsh light of Caleb's accusations, that feeling seemed like proof of her own depravity. She was the traitor's widow, a fallen woman who had lured a good man to his ruin and then turned to his promised bride for, what? Comfort? Love? It was monstrous. This self-loathing festered inside her, looking for a target, and Lillian was the only one there. The breaking point came on the second afternoon. The sky had been growing dark all day, the air thick and heavy with the promise of a storm. A low, constant wind began to moan around the corners of the cabin. Lillian was sitting at the small table, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of quiet, resigned misery. "We should talk about what we're going to do," Lillian said, her voice barely a whisper. "When he comes back." Clara, who had been aggressively scrubbing an iron pot, slammed it down on the hearth. The noise was a gunshot in the tense silence. "What is there to talk about?" she snapped, her voice trembling with a rage that was aimed as much at herself as at Lillian. "He'll come back with his paper, and he'll take half of everything. Or maybe he'll take all of it. What does it matter?" "It matters," Lillian insisted, her violet eyes pleading. "Clara, we can fight him. My lawyers." "Your lawyers?" Clara let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "That's always your answer, isn't it? Your money, your lawyers, your powerful father. You can just pack up your trunk full of Eli's promises and go back to your world. What about me, Lillian? Where do I go when he takes this place?" "I wouldn't leave you," Lillian cried, rising from her chair. "How can you even think that?" "How can I not?" Clara rounded on her, her eyes blazing with a mixture of pain and fury. "You lied to me. You kept a secret that is going to cost me everything." "It was not a lie. It was my shame. It was mine to carry. And now it's mine, too," Clara shouted, her control finally shattering. "Everything you touch turns to trouble. You come here with your tragic story and your black dress, and you bring nothing but ruin. First Eli, now me. You are a curse." The words were poison, and she knew it as she said them. She was taking her own guilt, her own fear, and twisting it into a weapon to hurt Lillian, because hurting Lillian was easier than facing the truth of her own tangled heart. Lillian recoiled, her face ashen, her eyes wide with a deep, profound hurt that went beyond anger. She looked at Clara as if seeing a stranger, a cruel and twisted version of the woman she had come to know. The fight went out of her, replaced by a chilling, absolute stillness. "I see," she said, her voice a dead, hollow whisper. She stood there for a long moment, the silence broken only by the rising howl of the wind outside. Then, without another word, she turned and walked to the corner where her trunk sat. She opened it. The first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the window pane. Clara watched, frozen in a state of horrified paralysis, as Lillian took out the black silk wedding dress. She methodically unbuttoned the simple homespun dress she was wearing and let it fall to the floor. She stood for a moment in her chemise, a pale, vulnerable figure in the growing gloom of the cabin. Then she pulled the black dress over her head. The silk rustled, a sound like dry, whispering leaves. It was the armor she had arrived in, and it was the armor she would leave in. "What are you doing?" Clara asked, her voice cracking. "I am removing the curse," Lillian said. Her back still to Clara as she fastened the tiny buttons. Her voice was devoid of all emotion. "I should have left the day I arrived. I see that now." She turned, a funereal queen in her gown of mourning. "You will have your farm. Clara, Caleb Stone wants a piece of his brother's legacy. He will have no claim if his brother's fiancée is gone." She walked to the table and picked up a quill and a small piece of paper. She wrote a few lines, her hand swift and steady. She folded the note and left it on the table. "Give this to him," she said. "It relinquishes any claim I ever had to Eli, or to anything he ever gave me. He can have his blood money back." The rain was coming down in earnest now, a steady, determined drumming on the roof. Lillian walked to the door. Her hand rested on the latch. She didn't look back. "Lillian, wait!" Clara pleaded, the rage inside her collapsing into a black hole of panic. "The storm!" "I am used to storms," Lillian said, her voice flat. "Goodbye, Clara." And then she was gone, the door closing with a soft click behind her, leaving Clara alone in the roaring silence. For hours, Clara sat unmoving as the storm raged outside and inside. The rain lashed the cabin, and the wind shrieked like a banshee. Every gust felt like an accusation. The note on the table seemed to pulse in the gloom. She had done it. She had driven away the only person who understood, the only person who had stood by her. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She was what they all said she was, a curse, unworthy of kindness, unworthy of love. Finally, long after darkness had fallen, a restless, desperate energy seized her. She couldn't stand the sight of the cabin, of the empty chair, of the ghosts that now crowded the small space. She needed to do something, anything. She lit a lantern and climbed the ladder to the small sleeping loft, a space she rarely used. It was cluttered with old tools and broken furniture left by Jedediah. She began to clean with a frantic, punishing energy, throwing things aside, scrubbing at dirt that had been there for years. It was a kind of penance. Her foot caught on a loose floorboard near the eaves. Eli had been up here once. She remembered, checking the roof for leaks after a winter storm. Annoyed, she knelt to push the board back into place. It shifted under her hand, and she felt something beneath it. Paper. Her heart stopped. With trembling fingers, she pried the board up. In the small, dark space beneath, there was a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. It was heavy. She pulled it out and untied the leather thong. Inside was a stack of letters. They were in Eli's rough, familiar hand. Some were on proper paper, folded and sealed, addressed to Lillian Croft. Others were scrawled on scraps of ledger paper, a kind of journal, addressed to no one, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold them. She carried the bundle down the ladder and sat at the table, the lantern casting a pool of golden, flickering light. She opened the journal entries first, her eyes scanning the jagged words. October 12th. Met Clara Thompson today proper, Jedediah's widow. The town looks at her like she's poison. I see a woman working herself to the bone to keep from blowing away in the wind. There is a strength in her I have not seen before. It is a quiet thing. November 4th. Lillian's letter came. It is like getting a piece of the moon in the mail, so bright and strange and far away. She writes of books and music. It is a world I do not know, but she is lonely. I know what that is. January the 21st. Fixed the roof on Clara's barn. We shared coffee. She does not talk much, but her eyes do. They say she is tired. They say she is proud. They say she is afraid. She does not know how strong she is. March 9th. Lillian writes that her father will marry her to a man she despises. She calls her life a cage. A man does not stand by while a creature is in a cage. I have sent the money from Mother. It is all I have. It is not for her to love me. It is for her to be free. It is a promise. A man is nothing if not his promise. Clara's hands were trembling. For her to be free, not to buy her affection, to break her cage. Then she saw an entry that made her blood run cold. It was dated the day after the storm, the day after he had left her cabin. April 17th. I am a fool and a sinner. What happened last night? It was not right, but it was the truest thing that has ever happened to me. To feel her arms around me, I did not know I was drowning until she gave me air. But what can I offer her? My name, my future? I have already promised that to another. I have made 2 promises with one heart, and I fear it will tear in 2. Tears streamed down Clara's face, blurring the words. He hadn't left in disgust or regret. He had left in turmoil, torn by his own sense of honor. Finally, she picked up the last letter. It was sealed, but not addressed. It was newer than the others, the ink still dark. She broke the seal. To whomever finds this, it began. I do not know if I will have the courage to say these things aloud, but I must write them down, to make them real. I have made a choice. A man cannot ride 2 trails at once. My heart is here, in this hard land. It is with Clara, in her quiet strength. I have found a home I never knew I was looking for. She is not a part of my world. She is my world. But a promise is a debt. I owe Lillian her freedom. I will write to her and release her from any promise to me. I will tell her to use the money to build a life of her own choosing. I will not let her come here, to a life she is not made for, and to a man whose heart is no longer his to give. I have wronged 2 good women. I pray to God they can both forgive me, and I pray I live long enough to earn Clara's trust, and maybe, one day, her love. Eli Stone. The letter fell from her hands. The truth, in all its devastating, beautiful, and tragic complexity, washed over her. He had chosen her. He had loved her. And he had been trying to do the right thing by Lillian, to be a man of honor even when his heart was breaking. And she had driven Lillian out into the storm. Lillian, the woman Eli had tried so desperately to set free. Lillian, the woman who had also been loved, and also been wronged. Lillian, her partner, her friend. A strangled cry escaped Clara's lips. She looked at the note Lillian had left for Caleb, a final act of sacrifice, without a second thought. She crumpled it in her fist. She grabbed her oilskin coat and ran out into the tempest. The rain was a solid wall of water, and the wind tore at her, but she didn't care. She half ran, half stumbled to the small barn, her lantern swinging wildly. She threw the saddle on her mule, her fingers clumsy and numb with cold and haste. She had to find her. She rode out into the black, roaring night. The road to the stagecoach depot was a river of mud. The wind screamed through the pines, and branches crashed in the woods around her. She had no idea how long Lillian had been gone, or if she could even find her. She just rode, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, her mind chanting a single, desperate prayer. Let me not be too late. She found her at the old wooden bridge that crossed Harmony Creek, a mile out of town. The creek, normally a gentle stream, was now a raging brown torrent, smashing against the bridge's pylons. In the middle of the bridge, a lone figure stood, a black silhouette against the churning water. Lillian. She was just standing there, her face turned up to the punishing rain, her black dress plastered to her body, as if waiting for the storm to wash her away. Clara slid from the mule and ran onto the bridge, the timbers groaning and shaking beneath her feet. "Lillian!" she screamed over the roar of the water. Lillian turned, her eyes wide and blank in the lantern light. She looked like a ghost, all the fight gone from her. Clara stumbled to a halt in front of her, gasping for breath, the rain and tears streaming down her face. She couldn't form the words. She couldn't explain, so she just held it out, the crumpled, rain-spattered letter from Eli. His last testament. Lillian stared at the letter, then up at Clara's face. She saw the truth there. In Clara's desperate, pleading eyes, she saw the apology, the understanding, the shared, unbearable grief. And then the words were no longer necessary. With a choked sob, Lillian fell into her arms. Clara held her tight, a desperate, anchoring embrace against the fury of the storm and the pain of the world. They clung to each other on the shaking bridge. Two survivors in the wreckage of a good man's heart, the full, tragic truth finally known. The anger was gone, the jealousy was gone. All that was left was a profound, aching love for the man they had both lost, and a fierce, unbreakable bond with the one person who remained. "Come home," Clara whispered into her hair, her voice breaking. "Please, come home." The journey back from the bridge was a pilgrimage. The storm, having spent its fury, softened to a steady, cleansing rain. They were soaked and shivering, their bodies chilled to the bone, but they were bound by a truth that was warmer than any fire. They didn't speak. There was no need. In the lantern's glow, Clara had seen the story in Lillian's eyes, and Lillian had seen the apology and the promise in hers. They had read Eli's final letter together in the meager shelter of the pines, the rain dripping from the branches like tears, and the full, tragic scope of his love and his honor had settled over them, not as a weight, but as a benediction. When they returned to the cabin, the air inside was still and sacred. Lillian took off the heavy, sodden black dress for the last time and, without a word, Clara wrapped her in a thick wool blanket. They sat before the newly stoked fire, sharing a pot of hot coffee, their hands wrapped around the warm tin cups. The ghost between them was finally at peace. They were no longer two rivals mourning a man who had divided his heart. They were two women who had been loved by him, each in a way she had needed, and they had, against all odds, found their way to each other. Caleb Stone returned precisely 2 days later, just as he said he would. He did not come alone. With him was the town clerk, a nervous man named Peters, clutching a freshly drawn legal document. But Clara and Lillian were not alone either. Tethered to their fence was a handsome but tired-looking gelding, a horse clearly bred for city streets, not rugged trails. And sitting on their porch, in a well-tailored but dust-covered suit, was a man who looked as out of place in Harmony Creek as a diamond on a dusty boot. He was thin, with spectacles perched on his nose and a neat leather valise at his feet. This was Mr. Alistair Finch, junior partner at Davies, Peabody, and Finch, who had arrived on the morning stage after a grueling, non-stop journey from the nearest telegraph station. Caleb pulled up short, his aggressive confidence faltering as he took in the scene. He had expected to find two frightened, defeated women. He had not expected to find a lawyer from Boston looking as calm and composed as if he were in a courtroom on Beacon Hill. "Mr. Stone, I presume?" "Mr. Finch said, rising to his feet. His voice was not loud, but it had the dry, crisp authority of old paper and ironclad law. "I am Alistair Finch. I am here representing the interests of Miss Lillian Croft and, by extension, Miss Clara Thompson." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "This is a family matter. We don't need any Eastern pencil pushers involved." "On the contrary," Mr. Finch replied smoothly, opening his valise. "When it involves a legal claim to titled property, it is precisely the time for pencil pushers. I have reviewed the bill of sale for this property, as well as the relevant territorial statutes. Mrs. Thompson's claim, as the sole heir to her late husband's estate, criminal convictions notwithstanding, is legally sound. Your claim, based on what you call blood and sweat, has no standing in a court of law. The trial, such as it was, took place not in a formal courtroom but in the largest room in town, the main floor of the saloon, cleared of its tables. A traveling circuit judge, a weary but impartial man named Abernathy, presided. The entire town seemed to be there, packing the room. their faces a mixture of avid curiosity and judgment. This was the final act of a drama they had been whispering about for weeks. Caleb Stone, representing himself, spoke first. His voice boomed in the quiet room, filled with righteous anger. He spoke of family honor, of his brother's hard work, of the sweat Eli had poured into a farm that was not his own. He painted a picture of his brother as a simple, good-hearted man who had been manipulated by two clever women, one a pariah who had latched onto his kindness, the other a wealthy schemer who had taken his money and his promises. He held up the bank draft for $200 as his primary evidence of fraud. "He gave her his legacy," Caleb thundered, pointing a thick finger at Lillian. "And for what? For a pile of love letters and a broken promise. And he gave this one." He shifted his aim to Clara. "His time, his labor, his very life. This land was paid for with Stone family sweat and Stone family money. It belongs, by right, to us." He sat down to a murmur of sympathetic agreement from some of the ranchers in the crowd. His argument was simple, emotional, and it resonated with their own hard-bitten sense of justice. Then Mr. Finch stood up. He did not shout. He did not gesture wildly. He simply laid out the law, piece by piece, like a man assembling a perfect, inescapable trap. He presented the legal documents. He cited the statutes. He calmly explained that familial sentiment, however strong, did not supersede a legal bill of sale. "As for the matter of the $200, Mr. Finch said, turning to the judge, "My client, Miss Croft, has already signed an affidavit, which I have here, relinquishing any and all claim to that money. It has been returned, in full, to the Stone family estate. She accepted it not as payment, but as a gift, a promise of a new life from the man she intended to marry, a promise she has now, tragically, released." He made Caleb's weapon look like an act of Lillian's noble character. He had won on points of law. The judge was already nodding, but Clara knew it wasn't enough. To win the law was to win the land, but to win the peace, she had to win the town. She had to give them the truth. She stood up, her heart hammering. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "May I speak?" Judge Abernathy looked at her, then nodded. "Proceed. Mrs. Thompson." Clara walked to the front of the room. She was not holding a legal document. She was holding a single, folded piece of paper. Eli's last letter. Mr. Stone is right about one thing," she began, her voice gaining strength. "His brother, Eli, was a good man. He was a man of honor, and he was torn. I know this, because he left this behind." Her eyes swept the room, meeting the curious, hostile, and pitying gazes of her neighbors. "Most of you have only known me as Jedediah Thompson's widow, a name I have carried in shame. You have judged me for it, and I have never spoken a word in my own defense. But I will not stand here and let you judge the heart of a man like Eli Stone without knowing the truth of it." And then, her voice ringing with a fierce, protective love, she read the letter aloud. She read of his love for her, for the quiet strength he saw in her. She read of his promise to Lillian, a debt of honor he felt he had to pay to set her free. She read of his conflict, of his prayer for forgiveness, of his final, heartbreaking choice. When she finished, a profound silence filled the saloon. It was so quiet she could hear the buzzing of a fly near the window, the legal arguments, the claims of ownership, the whispers and the gossip. It all faded away, replaced by the raw, undeniable truth of a good man's conflicted heart. No one looked at her with scorn anymore. They looked at her with a dawning, sorrowful understanding. They were not looking at the traitor's widow. They were looking at the woman Eli Stone had loved. Judge Abernathy cleared his throat, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "The law in this matter is clear," he said, his voice husky. "But the heart, it seems, is clearer still. Title of the property is awarded, free and clear, to Mrs. Clara Thompson." That afternoon, Clara did something that shocked the town even more than the letter had. She went with Sheriff Brody to the town clerk's office and filed a second document. It was an addendum to her new title, officially setting aside a 20-acre parcel of her land, the section with the best grass and access to the creek, as common grazing land for the use of any citizen of Harmony Creek. It was an act of unimaginable generosity from a woman to whom the town had shown none. It was not a plea for acceptance. It was a declaration that she was, and always had been, a part of their community. The farm changed. The sign that Jedediah had crudely painted, the Thompson place, was taken down. In its place, Clara and Lillian hung a new one, its letters carefully and beautifully painted by Lillian's steady hand. It read simply, "The Haven." It was no longer just their home. It became a sanctuary. The first woman to arrive was a young widow whose husband had died in a mining accident, and who was being pressured to marry her husband's brutish brother. Clara and Lillian took her in without question. Then came a young girl, no older than 16, cast out by her family for loving a boy they deemed unsuitable. Then another, an older woman whose children had moved west and left her with nothing. The small cabin was expanded. A new wing was built, with 2 small, clean rooms, Lillian's untouched money. The $200 was sent back east not in defeat, but as a request. It returned in the form of books, blankets, medical supplies, and seeds for a larger garden. The farm became a place of healing, a refuge for the women the world had tried to break. Clara, with her practical skills, taught them how to farm, to mend, to be self-sufficient. Lillian, with her education and gentle spirit, taught them to read, to write, and to reclaim a sense of their own worth. They were no longer defined by the men they had lost, but by the community they were building. One morning, just as the seasons were turning toward spring, they rose before dawn. The sky was a pale, soft pearl, and the air was crisp and clean. They rode out together, Clara on her sturdy mule, Lillian on the gentle mare she had come to call her own. They moved in comfortable silence, 2 figures perfectly in sync with each other and the quiet land around them. They stopped at the top of Watcher's Hill. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon, spilling liquid gold across the vast, sleeping plains. It was a sunrise of breathtaking beauty, a promise of clemency from a land that had so often been cruel. Eli's grave was no longer a raw mound of earth. Wild grasses had begun to grow over it, and a small, stubborn patch of bluebells had taken root near the simple wooden cross. Clara dismounted and walked to the grave. From a satchel, she took a small, perfect cluster of white roses, grown in their own garden. She laid them at the base of the cross, a quiet tribute to the man who had started it all. Then Lillian came forward. She was not wearing black. In her hands, she held a long, delicate piece of black lace, the edge of the wedding veil she had worn that first day. It was no longer a symbol of a wedding that never was, or a shroud of mourning. It was a memory, a part of her story. She gently tied it around the cross, where it fluttered in the morning breeze like a dark, graceful banner, a final, peaceful surrender. They stood there for a long time, side by side, their shoulders brushing, as the sun climbed higher, bathing the world in a warm, forgiving light. The wind, that constant, restless voice of the west, swept up the hill, rustling the grass and the lace. It swirled around them, carrying the scent of dust and roses and the promise of a new day. It felt like a whisper, a low, ancient murmur that spoke of a love that had no name, a love that had been forged in grief, tested in fear, and had risen from the ashes, stronger and truer than any simple promise, a love that had, like the toughest wildflowers, learned to bloom in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. Thank you so much for joining us for this story. It means the world to have you listen. We're always curious to know where our stories are traveling. So please, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Clara and Lillian's journey. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales from the heart of the American frontier.